Okay, so Bree wanted me to talk about informed consent, teach to goal and teach back. And this talk is really meant to be very practical. And so I'm hoping that you sort of walk away with some practical tips. And the thing is many of you are already doing informed consent. You might have some tips for me and for the rest of the group. So, I would say as we're going along, when I'm sharing my screen, I can't necessarily see the chat, but I would say if you want to chat in a question and maybe Sarah or Nick can stop me, or if you just want to speak up, we have a small enough group. I think that that's totally fine. And we should have hopefully plenty of time at the end to sort of talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah, we'll make a note of questions that folks post, and we'll try to synthesize them as best we can. But yeah, I think hopefully we'll have a good discussion after you get done. So Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, but like I said, shout it out. If you have a question while I'm going along, please feel free to do that. So the objectives today are just to talk just very briefly about consent in prisons, remind people about health literacy and consent, and then really get to the meat of the matter, which is teach to goal and teach back, with some evidence and examples, and then really how to do this. So consent in prisons. So this Nuremberg Code in 1947 sort of required that experiments that were being done were necessary, that they're conducted by qualified personnel, and that participants give their informed consent. So this was really the first time that informed consent was sort of coming to the forefront, and again, based on really egregious things that had happened to research participants. And then in 1979, there was this Belmont report that called for enhanced protections. So the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Human Research Protection, classifies prisoners as a special population requiring additional safeguards and no more than minimal risk, which I'm sure many of you know. And that with IRBs, that there's no connection to prisons, and that one member who's a prisoner or prisoner representative sort of has had a chance to sort of review some of this information. The other thing is that I don't know if you know about this 1991, which is called the Common Rule, which are the federal regulations that currently sort of dictate what's going on with consent. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it was actually just updated in 2019, which was the first time it had been updated since 1991. So when we think about, again, consent in prison, so what used to be the Institute of Medicine and is now the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, published sort of their groundbreaking ethical considerations for research involving prisoners. And if you haven't checked that out or don't know about it, you can find it online, and I highly recommend it. But they talked about that consent should be voluntary, free from coercion, and well understood. Which is, what does that mean? And I think the reaction, to consent from the 1991 Common Rule and from these considerations is that we do what we often do, I would say in law and medicine, that to make sure things are understood means that our solution is to create long and hard to read forms that sort of cover us, but don't necessarily make it easier for people to sort of understand. So that's kind of been the upshot. So when we talk about health literacy, I know many of you know this working with these populations, but sort of as a reminder, so what is health literacy? It's the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, and understand basic health information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions and needed to consent to be a part of a research study. So when we think about health literacy, there's a lot, and we think about consent, there's things that go into that. So it's reading and writing for sure, but it's also listening and verbal communication. Can somebody sort of hear what you're saying and actually speak up and ask a question? Numeracy in terms of computational skills and interpreting and evaluating risk, especially when we're talking about risks of informed consent. Or say, like in our trials, when we say you'll have a 50-50 chance of being in one of two groups, does somebody know what that means? And then again, self-efficacy, like I said, to sort of speak up if somebody doesn't understand this information. So when we think about the prison population and the population in general, we think about all the things that can affect health literacy. There's a lot of them. So there's, especially in the elderly, there's chronic disease burden. There's the number of medications or the types of medications somebody might be taking. There's mental illness. There's learning disabilities. There's hearing impairment, visual impairment, and cognitive impairment. And when you think about all these things together, and we think about the populations that we serve, a lot of these things come up for many people. So when we think about the prevalence, this is just of straight up literacy, not just health literacy. But there's something called the National Adult Literacy Survey that was done. And it's just something, I think it's like sobering every time I look at this slide. But they estimate that 22% or 40 to 44 million Americans test at the level 1, which is at less than a 4th grade reading level. This means that individuals can't read signs, medication bottles, poison control warnings, or a city bus schedule, and they definitely cannot read a consent form. And an additional 25% or 50 million people test in level 2. This is grade 4 to 8. So these people have difficulties with executive functions, such as filling out simple forms and reading something like the USA Today, which is at the 8th grade reading level. So this means that our, general population, 50% of people are going to have a hard time reading a consent form. And then when you think about, add on the other things in terms of educational level or other things that might be going on for other individuals in the slide that I showed you before, you layer all these things on top of that, especially for older patients or older prisoners, and then you've got some other issues there. So the average reading level in the US is at the 8th grade, but we know that for Medicaid and the elderly, it's only at the 5th grade reading level. And so when we think about the forms that we give to people and we think about what we should be giving to people, we should be targeting somewhere between definitely less than the 8th grade reading level and preferably around a 5th or a 6th grade reading level. So literacy and consent. So study was done actually in the New England Journal of Medicine in the early 2000s in 114 academic medical centers looking at their consent documents. And they used something called the Flesch-Kincaid scale. If you don't know what that is, it's actually on your Word program right now. So you can actually engage it and it can tell you what the grade level is of the materials that you're working on. So that's pretty cool. But they wanted to know the minimum grade level to read and understand, English text, and it's a range of 0 to 12. So the average readability score was at the 11th grade, and I would say that the majority were up sort of towards that higher end, and very few were sort of less than the 8th grade reading level. Sadly, when we think about the ways that we do informed consent, we can just talk about in the clinical setting. It's like, here's some papers, take a look at these, sign these, and let's just move on. And I would say, before I really started thinking about this and thinking about the ways that informed consent was taught to me, that's what I did with, our research patients, where it's like, here's some forms, take a look at these, fill them out so we can move on with what we're doing with our, research or the things that we need to do clinically. And I would say, I'm really thankful to the American Medical Association for putting out some of these videos about health literacy, but you can see with consent, we really could get ourselves in a lot of trouble if we don't go the extra mile. The other thing that I think that is really key here is that, studies basically show that over 90% of people who have difficulty understanding information, whether it's medical or otherwise, have basically never told anyone else that they have difficulty, basically due to shame, including spouses, family members, people close to them. And so people are not going to speak up and say, I don't understand this. And really, again, the onus winds up being on us to make sure that they understand. So this gets back to that New England Journal of Medicine study, and this is where I would love a little bit of interaction from the group. We're going to go over a consent example from a real consent form. And then we're gonna maybe brainstorm together about how we could make this a little bit easier. And then I'll share the example that they had from the New England Journal of Medicine article. So this says, I consent to the performance of operations and procedures in addition to or different from those now contemplated, whether or not arising from the presently unforeseen conditions which the above named doctor or his associates or assistants may consider necessary or advisable in the course of the operation. Never mind that they used his associates, but we'll leave that one for now. But can you think about ways that would be easier to just describe this to people? Does anybody want to hazard a guess of how you might say this to make it easier? Any brave souls?
I was just hoping someone else would do it. So the first thing I noticed is I think that is a single sentence with about 4 clauses, but I was trying to count the commas. Like we're trying to get our elementary school students to not write in such complex structures. Mm-hmm. So I just lost track of, yes, to what subject are we referring, and about halfway through it. So even breaking it up into a few pieces that are more readily digestible.
Right. Well, that's a great thought too, because I think when we think about health literacy, we think about writing these things, you really want to keep your sentences to, one, maybe at most 2 things, but anytime that you put in a comma, you want to ask yourself, could this be 2 separate sentences for the exact thing that you're saying, Stephanie, to make it easier? Any other thoughts?
Jennifer Lorvig put in the comments, which I that's what I was thinking of. Basically, something unexpected comes up, I give the doctor permission to do what needs to be done. I mean, that's kind of what my first thought is. All of this very convoluted wording is really, I give you permission to do your job, essentially. Yeah. If something unforeseen happens, please, use your medical professional skills and knowledge to take action. So, right, sort of getting at that essence, which I think Jennifer captures, kind of honing it down. What's the key point that's trying to be conveyed here, and how to say that as simply as possible?
Exactly. And this is what, so the folks in the New England Journal of Medicine paper basically took that and wrote this out. There's many different ways that you could say it, including what you just said, Nick. But I agree to other operations or treatments. My doctors may learn more in surgery. They may think I need other treatments. My doctors will decide in surgery. I agree to let them do the things they think are needed. You can see kind of what we're talking about, like short sentences, very concrete. So there are definitely ways that we could write these things to make them a little bit easier. Okay, so now we're going to get to sort of the meat of the matter in terms of teach to goal and teach back, and what the heck is that? So teach back is sort of, whenever you introduce a new concept, health information, advice, or, change in management, clinician, researcher, whoever explains the new concept, that person then assesses the patient recall and comprehension. Then they clarify and tailor their explanation, because maybe we didn't do a great job the first time in doing that, and then reassess the recall and comprehension. The patient recalls and comprehends, and then this was focused on adherence, but it's the same thing for really understanding consent information to be able to sort of be into a study. I'm seeing something on my screen that says Lauren entered the waiting room, and it says view or admit. Should I click on admit, or can you see that? Okay, good.
Got her.
All right. Hi, Lauren. Okay, so many consider this teach to goal process as a higher ethical standard of consent, both the National Quality Forum and the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research. And so, again, something that I think we really need to be including in our consent process. So I just want to tell you about the sort of modified consent process that we wound up sort of at the time, it seemed innovative, which was crazy because nobody else was sort of doing this. But we were doing an advanced care planning study at San Francisco General Hospital, which is a county hospital in San Francisco. And we were very concerned and wanted to make sure that our patients really knew what they were getting themselves into. At the time, there were no consent forms that we could find as examples or templates that were easy to read. And we actually had to fight with our IRB for 6 months to allow us to create a consent form that was written at a 6th grade reading level because they had never seen it before, and make sure that it was translated appropriately into both English and Spanish. But again, what was sort of crazy is that these things that I'm going to tell you about, like I said, it had never even crossed anybody's mind in our IRB. But what we did for the consent, and this is important when I tell you about the results of what we found, is that we wrote this consent form, 6th grade reading level. We sat down with participants and we read verbatim the entire consent form in English and Spanish, stopping frequently to ask if they had questions and to clarify anything. We followed this up with a really simple knowledge assessment. These were simple true-false questions about the consent content. So for example, we were telling them that we were going to ask them questions about themselves and we were going to have them look at advanced directive documents. We said nothing about, say, getting their blood checked. And one of the questions would be, if you're in this study, will we be checking, will you be, giving us a blood sample? And then we went back and we did teach to goal, which is that repeated targeted education until comprehension was achieved. So the thing that's interesting is that this is the number of passes that's required to complete the consent process. So you can see that about 1/3 of people were able to get through the consent process on the first pass, but 2/3 of people needed more than one pass. So 52% needed 2 passes, and about 20% needed 3 or more passes. That should say 3 passes. I will say that we were able, and this is in 205 participants, we were able to sort of get everybody consented within the 3 tries. The thing that's really important is that as the literacy score decreased, and that's sort of like going along the x-axis from high to low literacy, the odds of requiring more passes increased. That's, I think, fairly intuitive. I think the other thing that was interesting is that if consent is given in a non-native language, people require more passes. So these are people that said to us, I speak English very well, when we asked them. Or I speak Spanish very well. But then if that language was not their native language, all of those people needed another pass through the consent form. So what about teach to goal in prisons? So this is a study that we did with Bree and Cyrus that looked at 129 older adults in Bay Area jails. The average age was about 59. And so these were the attempts needed to correctly answer all questions. So, this was actually higher than ours. About 45% could get it in one pass, but about 44% needed 2 and about 7% needed 3. And then there were some people that just could not complete it within the 3 tries. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and what to do about that. So in terms of the evidence too, so if you look at other things like somebody using a metered dose inhaler, the upshot of this study was that literacy is actually surmountable by using teach to goal. So in thinking about mastery in terms of doing this, that 21% were able to do it by the 2nd pass and 10% by the 3rd pass. And when they looked at surgical consents at 7 VAs using TeachBack, and this is for surgical procedures, that it improved comprehension 53 to 70%, including the key risks. And it takes our staff a little bit longer, frankly, than 2.6 minutes, but maybe surgeons talk a lot faster, I don't know. But just to say that it didn't take that much more time to sort of do it. So there's a new review that just came out in 2020 that we wrote, looking at enhanced informed consent and what are all the things that you can do for consent to help patients. And when we look at patient consent comprehension, we get about 43% with written interventions, 56% with audiovisual interventions, 67% with multi-component interventions, but 100% with teach back. And again, this gets back to when we think about what should we be doing. Well, clearly we should always be doing teach back because it's really the only way that we can verify that people know what they're getting themselves into. So let's talk about teach back and teach to goal. And this is really like the how-to part of this. So we were talking a little bit before about written consent literacy principles. So if you want to know anything about health literacy, I recommend going to the Harvard Health Literacy Resources link. You'll be getting these slides so you can see them, but there's like just a ton of information there about how do you actually create some of these materials. But I think the key things are some, clear headings, white space. You often can have pictures on a consent form, but some from other of your research materials thinking about that. Simple words, large font. So for example, we really shoot for about 14-point font, particularly for older adults who might have some visual impairment. The short sentences, as we were talking about, and like that really kind of how-to voice. Again, more tools if you want to know how to create appropriate written materials for consent or other things. We talked about the Flesch-Kincaid reading evaluator that is actually wrapped right into the Word program that can tell you the sort of reading level. I also put this thing called the Lexile framework, which is supposed to be a little bit more granular. I don't think it's needed because you can get most stuff on the Word doc, but just to say and let you know that you are aware of this, if you really want to get granular, this is actually used in education. More so to really figure out, is this information appropriate for second grade or third grade level, that kind of thing. And if you go, you can set up a free account and you basically just copy and paste your materials in and it will tell you what grade level. Getting back to the Harvard resources, they have this really great thing called the suitability assessment method. So this is rating criteria on 22 factors in 6 categories. And again, if you're creating things for research participants or your patients or for any other reason, it really kind of helps figure out, gets you really thinking about things like content, literacy demand, graphics, layout, typography, all of those things. And the goal really is to hit 70% or higher on this point scale. And so I think I have found it and other people have found it to be really helpful. I know of some health, this is really great. I think over time, some health systems have started using this assessment when they evaluate whether or not they will accept a form, including consent forms and other things. And so it's just a really great standard to think about. This is just getting back to some things about visual impairment. We won't spend time talking about what macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, cataracts, and glaucoma are, but just to say that this is what people see. And I think when we're showing people things or we're thinking about what they can, read and see, a lot of people with these eye impairments have problems reading with contrast perception and glare. And so I think when we think about, well, what are we going to give people, whether or not it's, a written intervention or if it's a consent form, that we really, again, want to think about that large font, 14-point, if you can get it, bright contrasting colors, and actually black on white is the clearest, decreasing glare. So, those really fancy, like glossy pamphlets and things that you hand out to people, like Kiss of Death, like terrible because there's just too much glare and people can't see. And then consider these non-serif fonts. So serifs are these little extra squiggly things that are on letters, and those for people who have eye impairments, it's hard for them to see. So something like Helvetica or Arial are these what they call sans serif or no serif fonts to consider. So this is getting back to the common rule that we were talking about before, which, as I said, was updated for the first time since 1991, just in January of 2019. And in their report, they basically said it has long been recognized that under the current rules, consent forms have been growing longer and can be difficult to understand. They too often appear to be designed more for protecting the legal interests of institutions conducting research than for helping someone make a decision about participation. And they require to begin now with a concise and focused presentation of the key information. And for many organizations, I can tell you at UCSF, and you'll have to think about what's going on at your particular IRB, if a consent form is over 6 pages, which can often happen for, say, cancer trials and things like that, they have mandatory language that must be used that come from the common rule. So this is an example of the 2019 Common Rule, required language over 6 pages. And they say statements in gray highlighted are required for new federally funded and federally conducted studies as of January 2019. And I will say that when we think about informed consent in general, when I was telling you before about the 11th grade reading level and some of the things that were going on, this is somewhat better, but I would say not completely. So some of the resources, this is at UCSF, and I just put this here because I think it's kind of helpful. This is criteria required by federal regulation to approve informed consent. This is a nice checklist that you can go through when you're trying to, create your consent forms, and what are all the things that your IRB is most likely going to need in order to approve it. And this is federal regulation.
Rebecca, I just had a real quick question when I was thinking about the last thing. Have you or anyone else studied in terms of how attentive people are in consent documents that are more than 6 pages? Because I've seen, you're right, in a lot of clinical trials, especially, drug trials, and this is true, for those of us in working corrections where you have COVID therapeutics and vaccines, and there's this mountainous consent form. I've seen some of these, and they have all this required language, but in addition to understanding the information, at some point you just kind of like, okay, I can't get through anymore of this consent form. I don't know if is that a factor that people consider in terms of the actual length of the document?
Oh, absolutely. Like when we think about, cognitive burden, right? And I would also say, I don't know about you, but I feel like my own attention span over time has just been like decreasing and decreasing. And so I think what I bristle about for UCSF in terms of the 6-page rule is that if you take something simplified and you're using 14-point font and double space and white space, which is what you should be doing for literacy purposes, if that kicks you over 6 pages, it's not really the length. It's like, how is this laid out? I have seen like 15-page informed consent documents with 8-point font and no spacing and no white spacing. And like, yeah, I think people can't attend to it. It's really scary. And I think the thing is that, we have to think about like, what's happening in those interactions. So, I can tell you, like on the clinical side, if, you have appendicitis and you're in pain, give me the form and I'm just going to sign it. And sometimes like that woman that talked about how she had a hysterectomy and didn't even know, she knew she had pain and she went in to talk to someone to get fixed, but had no idea what she was signing up for. That we often, our patients are often in that situation that they're consenting to things that they don't fully understand. And I would say as well, that oftentimes, say like in that vaccine trial or other things going on, when there's something that has like 15 pages and it's really complicated, so I was talking about, people are not going to tell you that they don't understand. Most times the consent form is handed to someone, it's not read to them, so we have no way of knowing whether they fully understand it. And there's usually a power differential in that relationship where you're wanting somebody to do something. And when we think about prisoners who are, might get an incentive if they're in the study, or, there might be something that they think of as benefit, or we tell them as benefit as a way to coerce people to be in our studies. I just think that we need to think about that, because we have seen, studies have shown that some people are willing to just say yes without, to your point, Nick, without even knowing what the study is about. And so it does happen. I think one of the other resources that I was going to give you guys just to think about, this isn't perfect, but I think this National Comprehensive Cancer Network tried to at least take a stab at coming up with lay terms for typical medical things. Like I said, it's not 100% perfect for all lay language, but if you're studying something and you're wondering, is there an easier way to say this? This might be a place to at least start that search. So, examples again from our study procedures, as we were sort of talking about before, and this is really just to remind you guys about what is the modified consent process. Is the consent form, again, written at a 5th or 6th grade reading level, forms read to the potential subjects verbatim, allowing time for questions and discussion, and then assessing comprehension with teach back. And then if questions are not answered correctly, repeating that education and reassessment until complete comprehension is achieved. We do up to 3 attempts. I can tell you, working with Bree and other people, that some people do different things. So some people will say, after 3 attempts, I'm just going to stop. And we've done that with some of our studies. And some of our other studies, we've done the 3 attempts. Then we've assessed for cognitive impairment. And if somebody, if there is exclusion for cognitive impairment, then we will exclude them. And then there have been times where people haven't been able to do it in 3 attempts. I'll just give you an example of one person couldn't do it in 3 attempts. We assessed their cognition was perfect. And then we went back to, in this thing that we were going to do one more, so it would be a 4th pass through. And as we were talking to this person, they were like, oh yeah, like I left my hearing aids like at home, so I can't really hear you. So we got them like a pocket talker, which amplifies sound. And like, they were like, oh yeah, I totally get this now. So that's just to say that this person wasn't going to speak up and tell the person who was reading this consent form with them that they couldn't hear. And it had all to do with hearing and not with anything related to, cognition or their ability to provide informed consent. So I think, like I said, you can think about in terms of your study procedures, if it makes sense just to stop after the 3 attempts, or if you want to go on to do, additional assessments. But to that point, I will say, based on some of the things that we've learned, we've preemptively asked people, do you wear glasses? Do you use any kind of hearing aids or hearing amplification? And let's make sure you have all of those things before we start any of this process. So I just wanted to show you just visually sort of an example of a consent form. This was back in 2014, before some of this required language. But just to show you that this is like 14-point font, it's, sort of more simply laid out with like, key headings, bullet points, and those kinds of things. When we talk about procedures, there's still a lot in there. And I think that's why we really sit down and kind of go over it with people. I just put this UC template over here. So this is part of the updated common rule, where you can see that they're still using like 10 to 11-point font. They're using some bullet points, so that's good, but a lot of these things sort of still get squished together, which I still think we can do a better job visually. Yeah, it's just some more other things. Consent form looks like. And so, the one thing that is sort of frustrating to us is that the new common rule language for all consent forms has to have this statement. So you have the right to decline to be in this study or to withdraw from it at any point without penalty or loss of benefits to which you are otherwise entitled. Again, are you kidding me? Like, why? So, we have to put that on our consent form, and then we'll say, well, let us tell you what this really means. And we've used some consent forms where we actually have that, and then we say what this means is, and we just chunk it down into smaller pieces, wherever we're like forced to use some of this mandatory language. So how do you actually do the teach back or teach to goal? So this is getting into the logistics. So when you have your informed consent, you know, and things are crazy now because a lot of things are happening on Zoom and maybe not in person, but when you're in person with someone, having 2 copies, you read the forms together with them. And I know this seems sort of intuitive, but you know, whenever we go over it with new research assistants that we're training, you know, we remind people, like, actually point to the words that you're reading. One of the other things that we'll do, again, to decrease cognitive burden is that sometimes we'll use white paper to cover the pieces of the consent form that we're not talking about. So you can at least cover like half the page, because again, otherwise for people who have difficulty reading, it's kind of like a word onslaught to people, and it can be hard for them to sort of process what you're talking about. And then I think one of the key things is that after every section, like, why is this study being done? Who's paying for this study? To just stop and say, you know, do you have any questions about this page, or what questions do you have about this section of the consent form that I can help answer, so that you're not getting through the whole thing and then they can't even remember what their questions are. And then this is the consent verification. So before signing this form, we have to make sure that I explained everything correctly. I'm going to ask you some questions about the form we just read through, but all the answers are right on the form, and you can look at your copy when I ask the questions. It's okay if you don't know the answers. It just means that I may not have explained it very well. If there's anything you don't know, just say so, and we'll go over those parts of the consent form again. And then they must answer correctly all questions to be able to be in the study. They should not sign unless they've accurately been able to complete the consent verification in 3 tries. And this is, hopefully you guys can see this, this is sort of what the consent verification looks like. And I'm happy to, this is again from this particular study, yours will look different. You know, but up on the top is the script that we have for the research assistants, which I just read to you. And on this page, it talks about like study goals and procedures. So in your own words, can you tell me why we're doing this study? And then what will happen if you take part in this study? What will we ask you to do? And then this is about duration, voluntariness, risks, benefits, and questions. So how long will you be in the study? Do you have a choice about taking part in the research study? What are the risks? What are the benefits? Can you stop being at in the study at any time? And who should you contact if you have any questions? So after the teach back questions, you basically, you ask the questions, you find out which ones that they didn't answer correctly. You go back and you review the relevant sections of the consent form, and you repeat the questions they initially got incorrect. So you did a great job. There are a few things that I may not have explained clearly. Let me go over a few lines of the consent form so that you can be sure you know what the study is about. And then if they fail the teach back after 3 times, or maybe after you decide to do cognitive assessments and come back, but you know, I'm sorry, but only people who can correctly tell us what the study is about can take part in it. This is for your protection. Thank you for taking the time to hear about the study anyway. And, you know, this has happened, you know, not infrequently to us, and people are like, oh, you know, they might be sad, but they're like, okay, I get it. Especially if we say like, this is for your protection. Or like this other person who can be like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't have my hearing aids. Let me go get those and let's try again. HIPAA, oof, don't get me started. If anybody on this call has figured out better ways to deal with HIPAA, please let me know. This is what it says on the UCSF website. You must use the UCSF HIPAA form for research conducted at UCSF. The authorization form cannot be changed except to fill in the blanks. And the HIPAA form is written definitely at a 12th grade or higher reading level and has teeny tiny font, and we're not allowed to sort of change it. So I can tell you that there are things on this form that I would never be in a research study if I were to read these. So who will disclose or receive my personal information? Things that are like required by law and government agencies in other countries. And how will my personal health information be shared? Share it with researchers in the US or other countries. Use it to improve future studies. Share it with business partners or the sponsor, or file applications with US or foreign government agencies. Are you kidding me? who would sign this form? Like, I tell my research assistants, I would not sign this form. I won't be in a research study because of this, right? And so this is really sort of a big problem. So we basically came up with script to describe what the HIPAA form is saying. We don't have time to go over all of that today. And actually it takes longer than the consent process to describe all the different pieces of HIPAA. But this form is called the HIPAA form, or permission to use personal health information or research. And I'll say sometimes, have you seen these forms? Sometimes they're handed out to you when you go to the doctor and they ask you to sign them. Have you seen them before? And many people, again, have seen them. They've never read them, but they can be like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. And I'll say we can read all of it together, or I can go over some of the main points. And to your point, sort of Nick, before, like when people see like just like a sea of words, a lot of people, I would say the majority of our study subjects will be like, well, could you just tell me the main points? And we'll take it from there. And that's where we have our script, where we've taken this and we actually hand them the script that we have, just like the consent form, where we've made it easy to read and understand so that they know sort of what's in it. And we'll say, this is a standard form that we're not allowed to change. We have no, and we'll say, we'll come right out and say, like, we really don't like the way that this is worded, because we would never share. We have no plans to share any of your information with other countries or business partners. We just want to let you know. And let's tell you all the ways that we're keeping your information safe. I would love to hear well, first of all, if you have any questions, for sure. But if any of you have done other things for informed consent or HIPAA that have worked well, or you've seen other people on this, we can all learn from each other. So any questions?
I have a question, Rebecca. This is Stephanie again. So we just had a renewal for our IRB, and we are guilty. The University of Louisville has a template for our consent form, and I think ours is almost 11 pages long. And even though we did read it across from one another on our own copies, it definitely took almost as long as the interview is to navigate the consent. But in the midst of the revision, we actually had a new advocate board. And so what we had been doing in the past hadn't really been drawn into question. But this time around, we got dinged, and they said that as it stands, your ability to follow up with folks after you've left during the interviews isn't going to cut it. We had essentially just said, you're able to write us at this address. Here's a phone number. You can also ask that a member of your unit, the correctional staff, will reach to the research staff and we can contact you that way. And they said that was a red flag. Of course, that makes sense, right? Because it's a coercive relationship and you don't know that they're going to. So how have I know that this isn't related to this particular element, but it is part of consent. Like, how do you all offer folks an opportunity to get back to you if they're incarcerated and maybe don't have a means to contact you? How has anyone done that?
I'm gonna have to ask Nick and others, because that's complicated. Before I turn it over to others about that, I just wanted to say that I think it's worth thinking about your institution, and can you push back on the literacy level of the forms? And like I said, back in the day, I went to the mat for 6 months, I feel like it was every day I was talking to someone else to give them data. You can use these slides and these these references to say this is a special, prisoners are a special population, and we have to make sure that they are not coerced. And this is when we think about it almost doesn't make sense. It's if legally you're worried about the fact that we're possibly coercing participants, don't you want to make sure that the information that they're seeing is easy to understand? So just to say, IRBs have come around over time. And so, think about, how you can do that. In terms of In terms of contacting for help, I would love to hear from other people. I know in some of the stuff that we've done with Bree, you know, we have the information for our study staff as well as information for like the general IRB, but then those people have to have the ability to actually call. And so I know that they have worked with, say, like jail staff to make sure that somebody at the jail like knows, you know, that they know there's a champion at the jail that knows what's going on, and that they can let that person know too if they're having issues or problems. But again, that's a power differential relationship that they may not trust that person either. So I would love to hear if anybody else has figured out a better way around that.
And I'll add for context for anyone who wants to chime in, there is also concern that if we offered them self-addressed stamped envelopes, that would be seen as too great an incentive, because that they would consent for the stamps.
Wow.
So I have a lot of questions about primary data collection, like these kinds of things that we've encountered that have just been, like, I don't know if they're just trying to keep us out, which I get. But yeah, so if anyone could figure it out, I love the idea of a study champion, about having someone on the inside who serves as kind of like a objective middleman, that someone could come to and ask the question. Yeah.
And is the pushback from your IRB, or is it pushback actually from the prisons?
It's been primarily the IRB, actually. Our DOC's been unusually accommodating. They're like, many times we're all just write the research liaison and just say like, hey, as a quick reminder, you guys agreed to allow a correctional unit member, staff member, to contact us if someone had a question, you know, 4 or 5 years out. You agreed that they could use the phone and give us a holler at no expense. And she's like, sure, I'll reiterate that to our wardens and our unit staff. So it hasn't been an issue so much. It was, again, I genuinely think the person was looking out for the population, which was, you're putting an undue burden on a group of people that probably doesn't have access to stamps to write you on their own accord, or to contact you through JPay. And Securus certainly isn't going to give them like, oh, Securus Technology, sure, we'll give you free email communication to this particular person.
The one other thing I'll say, and then I really want to stop talking so I can hear from other folks, but including thinking about literacy stuff or this issue, that's one of the powerful things about having, an advisory board. And that advisory board, as you're saying, it sounds like it includes staff from, the prisons. I know for Bree and others that it often includes, ex-prisoners and people who have experience. And when we've gone back to either it's our funder or it's the IRB to say like, our advisory group, these are the people that we're getting advice from, who work in that facility, who have been in that facility. They're telling us that they want X, Y, and Z. Nothing's more powerful than that, because how can you argue against what the people that you're actually doing the study for are telling you that they want or need, or that is okay with them? So again, if your advisory board is saying these consent forms suck and I don't understand them, and you need to make them, easier to read for our, prison population, that also is like a piece of information that can help you make that argument. But other thoughts for Stephanie from others?
Well, I mean, I will say that, yeah, over the years, I've had numerous encounters, both on the IRB and the corrections side, and have had a lot of different, pushback for various things. How do you give folks an incentive while they're still incarcerated? Using commissary accounts. That was a battle, but eventually that I won that battle. We were able to deposit money in people's accounts while they were still incarcerated to participate in an interview. I think the phone, that one's very difficult, because the private companies that control telecommunication in correctional facilities, that's a real tough nut to crack, so to speak. I mean, they really gouge, and they charge like $5-6 a minute or something ridiculous. There are, we have been doing actually a study I'm doing in our county jail, we started doing Zoom classes, but all of this for an intervention study. And we really it's taken a champion inside the jail or inside a prison. I think really that's, in my experience, you have to have sort of the IRB is one piece of it, trying to help them to understand and try to figure out, what is feasible and not. I mean, often I've had the pushback where you can't do research in prisons or jails, period. It's just, you just can't do it. And it make it prohibitively difficult.
Right.
And then you sort of have to push back, well, that's unethical. Why should you exclude people? And this is often, and it's often a problem, but at some point it's very difficult, because what are the kinds of studies? Often, I'm not aware of any prison really that's actively able to participate in things like clinical trials, even if folks could benefit. I mean, I don't know if none of the COVID vaccine trials were in prisons, even though those are the biggest hotspots in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So things like this are complicated, but I think that often if you have internal champions, then that really helps. And from the IRB perspective, I mean, I think that's usually, in my experience, if an IRB is not used to dealing with incarcerated populations as study participants, they're kind of like, okay, all kinds of legal alarm bells go off. And it's really more about their own sense of paranoia and their fears about what may or may not happen and getting into trouble. And I found that if you sort of start walking them through and say, look, here's what we do, here's our experience, we've done this before, other people have done this before, that helps a lot. It takes a while to kind of soften them up, so to speak, but it's everywhere I've been, I've always had to kind of go in. The IRB, their initial thing is, no, this is absolutely not, it's never going to work, there's no way you can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of gradually say, well, actually, so yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just sort of lots of difficult conversations. But yeah, Stephanie, happy to sort of talk offline about your specific problem more in depth.
I sadly have to jump off for my next meeting, but just to say that if people have questions or ongoing things that they want to talk about, let me know. And again, you'll have access to these slides and things. So thanks for having me. Thanks for doing the work that you guys are doing, and hopefully this was helpful.
Thank you, and yeah, we'll send out the slides to everybody, and yeah, I know we're a couple minutes over, so we'll sign up at this. Yeah, great talk. I think really super informative. So we're really appreciative. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Have a great day, everyone. Almost the weekend, although all the days blend in.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank
Bye.
you.